Hello class and welcome to lecture 2 from week 6 in the spring of 2020 at the University of Kurdistan. Last week and at the beginning of this week you should have gone through the theory of tendering, why we tender, and some key aspects of also cost estimation. The final part from this section in cost management has to do with budgeting and scheduling. How do we make sure the project, as it's going through its life cycle, is sticking to the budget? How is it performing financially according to the cost constraint that we set for the project? And also making sure that we can pay our bills. This comes down to the concept of liquidity. If you're not familiar with that term, we'll talk about that in a moment. So in this section, we're going to be talking about how do we allocate budgets. It's not enough to say, well, to build this bridge, it's going to cost $10 million. Actually, we need to break that $10 million down into various work packages, and how much will each of these work packages cost. We're also going to be talking about cumulative budget costs. This is a way to make sure you actually don't go bankrupt while you're managing a project. I'll explain that later. We're also going to be talking about tracking actual costs against budgeted costs. This is slightly different. This has to do with accrued accounting or accrual accounting as opposed to cash accounting. I don't know if you're familiar with those terms. If you've ever done accountancy, you will be, but I'm going to try and give you an explanation of this in this lecture too. We're also going to be talking about how do we determine the value of the work that is performed. And basically doing a cost performance analysis. Basically, how are we performing in terms of doing the project according to the cost constraints that we were given. And so this all comes down to basically forecasting and tracking. And so basically seeing how are we performing against a budget. So what is budgeting? Well, remember in the last section we learnt about cost estimating. Now, when you are doing an estimate, you do a series of estimates through the life cycle of a project, but the final estimate and the most accurate estimate, that actually becomes the basis for your project budget. Basically, you're going to be building the project infrastructure according to that budget, according to once everything is defined in terms of the project scope with appropriate time, cost, and quality constraints. The project budget is the cost constraint. That is what the project must be completed in that cost. If you go over budget, then you are exceeding the cost constraint that was set for the project. Now, how do we do this? Well, you can have a project budget for the entire project, but actually the way you start there is actually with the work breakdown structure. Remember we talked about the WBS when we talked about how you build your project team, how do you find the correct human resources to carry out the project. Well, the work breakdown structure is also used for determining the budget. Basically, all of those little individual work packages, you have to define what is an appropriate budget to achieve that work package, to bring it to completion before you can move on to the next work package. And the sum of all of the work packages, that is the total budget cost, or the TBC for the project. So let's have a look at a work package from a work breakdown structure now. So this is a work breakdown structure. And so you can see here that we've got a big project called the construction of a house, it seems. And basically we're breaking down in the form of a hierarchy all of the different parts of the project. So there's internal work, so that's the painting and the utilities, the electrical. We've got the foundations, and then we've also got the external work. So that's columns and roofs and walls, windows most likely, and they're being broken down further into smaller items. And so those smaller work packages, you can see they've actually got a percentage there, and that's probably the percentage of time spent on the work package in accordance with the entire work that needs to be done with the project. Often in civil engineering, I'll have to say I don't usually do it as a percentage. I actually assign a quantity, how much time needs to be spent in terms of man hours. And then we have a budget. So that's the amount of budget that is spent for each work package. And then you basically have the medium level work packages. So you can see the internal work is 86,000, the foundational work is 46,000, and the external work is 83,500. That means that the total budget cost for this project is $215,500 to build this house. So you can see here that with the work breakdown structure, we've analyzed each work package, we've worked out what work needs to be done, and we've built a budget, a cost for each item. And we may have tendered out some of that work, we may have done detailed estimates, we've probably worked out a bill of quantities, how much land is being excavated, for example, and what is the rate of hire for an excavator per hour, and so forth. And anyway, we've come to a budget. Now, I want to talk about how do you allocate for work packages. Well, it comes down to estimating, but there are two general perspectives that you could approach when you are budgeting for a work package. So the first way is basically a top-down approach. This is where you are basically determining what individual items are needed to carry out a particular work package. So this could be volume of concrete, fuel, labor, the tools you're using. And then you find those quantities and you multiply them by rates that you have determined for the entire project. Now, this is a top-down approach where basically you're trying to see where the work package fits in the entire project. Now, the trouble with doing this top-down approach is that often you can under-budget the total budget cost for the project. So let me explain this. Let's say you are building a high-rise, and that's the project. You're building a high-rise apartment, but one of the work packages is the installation of windows. Now, obviously, one of the key items in that work package of installing windows is the use of a crane. Now, to use a crane, the crane is already on site and it's being used for a number of different things. It's being used for lifting people up in a lift attached to the crane to get them to their workstation. It's being used to lift concrete to the roof. It's being used to take up supplies, it's to lift up piping and so forth. It's being used for all number of different work packages. But in this instance, we're using it for this work package of installing windows. Now, to use a crane, you've got a rate that you've determined for the total project estimate, and that is that to use the crane with a crane worker and a crane operator and everything else, that's basically $250 per hour. So you say, well, I need to use the crane for 200 hours to install windows, so I multiply 200 by 250, so that's what? That's $50,000. But the issue is there is also a cost of installing the crane and mobilizing the crane and bringing it to site. And so while the crane costs $250 every hour that you use it, there was also an additional $10,000 of cost to establish the crane at the site, to bring it from the yard, to hire it from the company, and to install it on site so it could be used for building this high-rise building. Well, what work package is actually going to allow for that in the budget? That's why those sorts of things, mobilizing cost, transportation cost, establishing the site, that's often overlooked in a top-down approach, because the person who's making the budget for his work package just assumes, someone else is going to include that in their work package, and then it doesn't get included. And so when budgets are below the real cost, this is often what happens. It's from a top-down approach. Now, a bottom-up approach is basically where you look at your work package and you assume basically it's not part of a bigger project. You think that your work package is the sole part of the project, and so you ignore all other things that are happening in the project, and you say, what will it cost to build windows in a high-rise building? And when you do that, you say, well, it's $200 per hour, 200 hours of crane use to install the windows, and a crane will cost me $250 an hour, but I also need to include the cost of establishing the crane, because you basically are assuming no one else in the project is going to use the crane, so you've got to cost it when you are budgeting your work package. Now, what can happen there is actually budgets are overstated, because basically you are going, if potentially lots of different people involved in the estimating and the budgeting are pricing different work packages, they are going to double up on the price of establishing and mobilizing a crane. I will budget for $10,000 for installing the windows for the establishment of the crane. Avan, who's budgeting for the lifting of masonry blocks, she will include $10,000 for the establishment of a crane when she budgets for her work package. And Taba, who's budgeting a work package for lifting up pipes and services and wire, she will budget in $10,000 too. And so the budget actually exceeds the overall cost that is we're actually going to face. We're only going to establish the crane once. And so how do we get around this? Well, basically we need to have good communication when we're doing the budgeting. That's why you have estimating teams. And so no one's working in isolation. And also you create a brand new work package called mobilization of crane, and that $10,000 will be set up in that work package. and that work package will basically be done before these work packages of installing windows, installing masonry blocks and so forth, where the crane use will be used. So I hope you can see the difference in a top-down approach and a bottom-down approach. They both have that. One has a tendency to understate the budget, and another one has the tendency to overstate the budget. And the solution to that is basically having good communication during the budget, making sure that there's no crossover, that no one is pricing something like a crane establishment multiple times or not at all if it's being missed out entirely, and then breaking down the work breakdown structure further and creating a work package for that particular item that affects other work packages. So I'm now going to go into budgeting. Once we've determined what our total budget cost is, we've got to recognize that actually, because a project has a long lifetime, we need to actually have a way to track if the project is being kept to budget. It's no use having a 3, 4, 5 year project and with a budget of 5 million, and you get to the very end and someone says, how much did we spend? Oh, 6 million. Oh dear, we went over budget. That's no good. You need to be able to track your budget in real time, and then if you're going over budget or you're going under budget or whatever, you can actually address that. So this requires that your work packages need to be scheduled. So not only are the work packages given an individual budget, but they are also given a particular time when they must be completed. Now, scheduling and planning, we're going to do that later. That's after this. Right now, we're looking at cost management. We're looking at cost constraint. The next part of project management, we are going to be looking at the second major constraint in project management, which is time constraints. And there we're going to be looking at scheduling and planning. Scheduling, sorry, is the word I should use. I don't want to confuse planning. That's how do we decide how we're going to bring about the project. And there we're going to allocate time to each work package. We're not there yet, so just don't worry about that. Right now, just assume that the work packages, you know when all of them are going to take place in the span of a project life cycle. Now, you can use this cumulative budget cost method to basically check if the project has enough liquidity. Now, what do I mean by liquidity? Well, you can look that term up on the internet, but liquidity is basically a business or an entity's ability, in this case a project team's ability, to pay their debts. So this is the other arm of business management. One arm is profitability. Will we make money if we do this project? And usually that's quite easy to determine. Or in the case of civil engineering projects, will there be a net benefit? Will the benefits exceed the cost, even if we include external benefits and costs? Now, the other arm of profitability is liquidity. And this is all about if a business or a project team can pay their debts. So let's say we are doing a project that takes 10 weeks to complete. And when the project is completed, the total project is going to cost $100,000, but we're going to make a $50,000 profit. So as the project management team, we're basically charging the sponsor $150,000. So we get a 50% markup, and we're thinking, great, we're going to make so much money in 10 weeks, $50,000, that's great, 50%. But over 10 weeks, it's going to cost you $100,000. That means it's going to cost you, let's say, $10,000 a week. Now, does the project team have $10,000 in capital to pay all of its costs, to pay the suppliers of materials, to pay the subcontractors? Well, unless they have $10,000 in the bank before they start the project, the answer is no. They don't have liquidity. So there's no point in proceeding with the project. Even though it's profitable, they cannot afford to do it. Now, they could maybe go back to the sponsor and negotiate and say, actually, it would be better if you pay us $25,000 of the profit after 5 weeks and the other $25,000 after 10 weeks, or you could pay us $5,000 in profit every week, or so forth and so forth. But actually, with the status quo, it's not feasible. There's no liquidity. The project will go bankrupt before it can be completed. Hopefully I can show that to you in the next example. Now, the cost benefit curve, what am I saying? CBC, that's something entirely different. The cumulative budget cost curve, that normally has an S profile. The curve is in the shape of an S. And that's basically because most of the expenditure in a civil engineering project is not done at the definition and planning stage or in the delivery stage. It's only most of the expenditures happening in that middle construction stage usually. So let's go through this. We've got an example here of you're building an unlined landfill. Remember, we looked at that example before when we were talking about estimating, where you're building a landfill where it just basically it's unlined. You're basically just digging a big hole on the ground for people to dump their rubbish in. Now, this project, it's already been scheduled. We'll get to that next week. But what are we looking at here? It's a 20-week project. Now, we've broken the project up into a few different work packages, but we're putting those work packages under different headings. So the different headings are design, construction, and then commissioning. Basically, just handing it over to the sponsor, probably the government, and saying, let me know if there's anything wrong with it. We can come back and change it a little bit. But it's a hole in the ground. It's not like there's much that's going to go wrong with it. It's not like a high-performance car or a train or anything like that with lots of moving parts. And you can see those numbers in there. Those are actually budgeted costs. So in week 1, we're actually spending $8,000 on design work. Week 2 is $8,000 on design work. Week 3, we're only spending $4,000 on design work. Week 8, we're spending $8,000 on design work and $10,000 on construction. We're beginning the construction phase. And so you can actually see there's a little bit of an overlap there. We're not beginning the construction after we finish the design. We can actually have a small amount of overlap. And then we have commissioning. Now, how do we determine that? Well, we basically look at the work packages. We know what the budget is for each of the work packages. and we know what week those work packages are happening in. And so with that, we can then add all of that up, and then we can make a total cost. So in week 9, for example, you've got 3,000 in design, 35,000 in construction. So the total budgeted cost is 38,000. That is how much money you will be spending as the project team in week 9. So most of that's in construction, but you're also hiring designers and other people. So yeah, 38,000 is what you're spending in week 9. Now the final column is the cumulative total cost, where basically you're taking the sum of that week's work plus the sum of all of the previous weeks. Sorry, that's the phone. Just pause this. Sorry, I had a phone call, so I can't quite remember where I was up to. But yeah, anyway, the total budgeted cost is $497,000 over 20 weeks, but it should become clear to you that the expenditure is not linear. It doesn't mean that we're spending 497,000 over divided by 20 every week. Sometimes it'll be more, sometimes it'll be less. So I think the most expensive week there, when I look at it, is actually, what is it? I think that's probably week 14. We spend 52,000 that week, and other weeks we spend a lot less. Week 20, when the project is winding down, there's usually not a lot of expenditure. Only 3,000 is being spent that week, just as an example. Now, a couple of key things you will notice is that basically with a civil engineering project, generally construction work is very expensive, and that can also take quite a long time. Commissioning work or basically handover, where you're basically training the sponsor how to use the project infrastructure, it's pretty simple stuff. It doesn't take a long time. There might be a few little reviews and tweaks and maintenance things that need to be fixed, but basically you don't need to teach someone how to throw rubbish into a hole. Usually that commissioning or handover stage delivery, I think is what we've called it in the project lifecycle section of this course. That's much larger for project management with software projects, for example, where you've got to teach the client how to use the software. And normally the planning and the definition and planning stages, they take a long time, but actually expenditure isn't that much because there's no specialist equipment being used. The project team is quite small at this stage, and so the expenditure is down too. And design work, usually the expenditure is not as much on a weekly basis as it is with construction. So let's now put that cumulative total on a line graph. Okay, so now we can see what we saw in the previous slide in a graph form, and right away you're going to see that it does actually have this little S bend to it. Do you see the shape of the S? The line isn't linear. It actually starts off reasonably flat and then it gets steeper and then it gets flat again. Well, that's because that's very typical of civil engineering projects, because normally the definition and the planning stage of a project and the design phase, as the case may be in this case, the expenditure is actually quite small on a per week basis. You don't have lots of equipment or materials you're buying. The project team is quite small usually at this stage, and so you don't have a lot of human resources costs. But then it gets really expensive on a weekly basis during the execution phase or the construction stage of the project. Then you've got hundreds of people running around on site and lots of wages. You've got big machinery with big hire rates and so forth, and it speeds up. And then the commissioning stage, or the delivery phase, as we called it in the project life cycle section of this course, that flattens out again, and it's usually quite short as well for a civil engineering project. Once you've dug the unlined landfill, there isn't really much more to do. You just give it to the sponsor, the client, and walk away. There might be a little bit of work where they review it and say, actually, we want you to change this a bit, we want you to dig the hole a bit deeper here, or we want you to plant a tree here or there, or there's a bit of a landslip there, can you fix that? But really there isn't too much work to do. So that's a typical cumulative budget cost for this unlined landfill project. Now, I've got a question for you. Is this project profitable, and is the project liquidable? Meaning, will we be able to pay our debts, pay our bills on time if we take this project? Well, for that we need more information. So this is the extra information that we have. We are a company and we're doing this unlined landfill as a design build contract. Now, as a company, as a project team, we have $300,000 in the bank. That's what we have in capital. Now, when the design phase of the project is completed, the client is going to pay us $100,000. And then when the commissioning is finished, when the entire project is finished, they're going to pay us an extra $500,000. So we're going to be being paid in revenue $600,000. So I've got a question for you. Is the project profitable for us as a company? Well, that's pretty clear, isn't it? Our revenue will be $600,000 and the expense will be $497,000. That means we will make $103,000 profit in just 20 weeks. It sounds like a pretty good project. We should probably do it, right? Well, remember though, we've got to consider liquidity. Liquidity being a measure of how easy it is for us to pay our debts. Do we have the capacity to pay our debts? That will determine if the project is possible. Remember, if at any point we can no longer pay our workers, they're going to stop working, and then the project won't get finished. And we will go bankrupt as a company. Even though this is a profitable project, if we cannot pay our debts on time, then we will not be able to complete the project. So look, we have $300,000 in the bank to begin with. We will be paid $100,000 when we finish the design phase of the project, and then we will be paid a further $500,000 when we finish the entire project. Okay, will we be able to finish this project? Well, let's look at it. This is called the liquidity test. This is basically a line graph where we're basically comparing expenditure, meaning money that we have to pay, alongside the money in capital that we have on hand. So let's look at this on the graph. So that blue line, that is the expenditure line. Remember that is the line that we saw beforehand. That is that S-shaped curve. That is the cumulative budgeted cost throughout the 20 weeks. Now, we have $300,000 in the bank, and that is showed with the orange line, which is income. It should actually be capital. If you've got income written up there, that should be capital, because the $300,000, that wasn't income from this project. This is capital against expenditure. So we have 300,000, and basically we have expenditure. And you can see the expenditure going up. And where's that money going to be coming from? That's going to be coming from the 300,000 that we have. Now, at around week 10, we finish the design phase, and it then goes up to 400,000 that we have in the bank. Now, what happens when at around week 5? Suddenly, our total expenditure at week 15, our total expenditure now exceeds the total money that we have in capital. That means at week 15, we will no longer be able to pay our debts. The workers will come in at the end of week 15 and say, pay us our wages, and the project manager will go, oh goodness gracious me, I have no money in the bank to pay you. That's what happens. And what happens next? They don't come into week 16, and basically the project goes bust because the blue line has gone over the orange line. And even though the project is very profitable, you can see that you've actually got the orange line considerably higher than the blue line at the end. And you're making over $100,000 worth of profit. Well, even though that may be the case, between week 15 and week 18, I think, your expenditure is exceeding your capital, and you will not be able to pay your debts. You have failed the liquidity test. That means you cannot do this project. Even though it will be profitable to you, you cannot afford to do it. You will basically go bust. So what do you do? Well, one thing you can do is you need to budget this in advance. Remember, this is all happening at the planning stage still. Well, you need to recognize that you're not actually going to be able to afford it. Around week 15, you're going to run out of money. So what can you do? Well, one thing you can do is you can get a loan from the Bank of Avan. So the Bank of Avan says, we will lend you $200,000. Now, that will be, and the Bank of Avan will give this to you at the start of the project. But when the project is at the end of the construction stage, remember, not the end of the project as a whole, she wants you to pay her back $200,000 plus $10,000 in profit. $210,000 you need to pay her at the construction stage, at the end of the construction stage. Well, with those conditions, is the project still profitable? Well, the answer is yes. Previously, the project was $103,000 in profit, and now you're taking away $10,000. That goes to Avan. So now it's $93,000 in profit. Is the project now possible? Does it have enough liquidity? We need to go back to the liquidity test to find out. Okay, well, let's look at this example then. We have now the same expenditure line, the blue line, that's that S-shaped curve. It's flattened a bit because we've got the graph is skewed. But the orange line has changed. The orange line starts at 500,000. Remember, at the start of the project, you have 300,000 of your own capital in the project company, and you've borrowed 200,000 from Avan. That in turn goes up by 100,000 in week 10 because you complete the design phase. And then look, basically at week 18, these lines just touch. That means at week 18 you are basically going to empty out your bank accounts more or less, because you're going to basically pay all of your workers and all of the expenses for that week, and you're going to empty out all of your capital, but you can pay it. And then you've got the profit margin. It's actually come down very slightly because you've now had to pay $10,000 to Avan, but who cares? You've got liquidity. So with this example, you will now not go bankrupt. Of course, the two lines are now touching one another, so that's less than ideal, because if you have just a small delay, if the project construction is closed for 1 week because of rain, or if there's a pandemic, or what happens if one of the work packages actually costs a bit more than you expected, suddenly you've got the same problem all over again. You've got no liquidity and the project will go bust. So ideally you want to have a little bit of gap constantly between the orange line and the yellow line, the capital line and the expenditure line, because that gives you contingency in case something goes wrong. Now, the other thing I want to point out here is that it was probably not necessary to borrow $200,000 from the Bank of Avan in week 1, because you didn't need extra capital then. You only needed to have that at around week 15, 16, I think. So, or 17 even. So if you had borrowed later, you wouldn't, and said we only need 200,000 for maybe 5 weeks rather than 15 weeks, then you wouldn't have had to have paid her so much profit. So ideally you don't want to be having a too big a gap between the orange line and the blue line, because that means you're actually losing out on there's an opportunity cost you're paying, where you could be using that capital elsewhere in other projects, in other investments as well. So ideally a good project manager and a good quantity surveyor, so a quantity surveyor is someone who basically tracks costs and the budget and the estimating, he wants the blue line and the orange line, the expenditure and capital lines, to be parallel, but he always wants the capital line, the orange line, to be have a healthy gap above the blue line. But remember, the moment it dips below the blue line, then suddenly you're going to go bust. And this is why most businesses that go bust, that go bankrupt, this is why it happens. It's not because they weren't profitable, it's because they didn't have enough liquidity. Anyone can actually do sums and determine if a business will be profitable or not. It's very easy to do. But the issue is liquidity. Will you be able to pay your workers and your subcontractors on time when they ask for payment? This is harder to do, and this is why most businesses that go bust go bust. It's because they don't look at liquidity, their ability to pay their debts on time. It's all very well if you're going to make a big profit in week 20, but if you can't pay your workers in week 15, then that's no good. You're going to go bust. So I now want to talk to you about cumulative actual costs. This is a little bit different to cumulative budgeted costs. So remember, with cumulative budgeted cost, we're actually looking at what our ability is to pay our debts. Now let's say with that unlined that unlined landfill project, I'm a subcontractor. You've hired me to be involved in the design work, and as as a very good civil engineer, if I don't say so myself, I would say that I would probably be demanding a salary of, oh, why not? Let's go for the skies. Let's say I'm going to say you need to pay me $2,000 a week, and you agree to it. Now, in the contract, though, I'm going to be working for 5 weeks, okay? And you're at the end of the 5 weeks, you're going to pay me in a lump sum. It's a lump sum contract. You're going to pay me $10,000 for 5 weeks of design work. Now, this is in cumulative budgeted costs. You would budget $10,000 for week 5 because that is when money needs to be paid. However, you are basically accruing debt to me on a weekly basis, and that is $2,000 a week. If at week 3 you've paid no money to me, but I have done $6,000 worth of work, and basically after 3 weeks of work you have committed to paying me $6,000, and when I complete, and so accrued accounting or accrual accounting as opposed to cash accounting is basically where you are measuring committed costs, not costs when they have to be paid, but costs as and when they are being accrued, basically when they are being recognized and will have to be paid in the future. So this is quite important in civil engineering. The reason being is that you have a lot of items in your work package where often you will have lump sum contracts with subcontractors, workers and so forth, and you pay at the very end of the project. However, in order to track the costs, rather than just paying those costs right at the end, it's good to track the costs on an ongoing basis. Now, labour is one of the big ones. Now, I've given you the example of me as a subcontractor, but for most labourers, even if they are employees and not subcontractors, they get paid once a month. Now, what's going to happen if during the first 2 weeks you actually work the labourers overtime, and then and you are looking at the cost benefit curve, the liquidity test with the cost budget, total budgeted cost, cumulative budgeted cost against capital, and you're thinking we're fine, the orange line is above the blue line. But then suddenly at the end of the month, you have hundreds of workers coming up to you saying it's payday and we've all worked overtime and now you have to pay us a lot more. You owe us a lot more than what you budgeted. Suddenly you could actually be failing the liquidity test. Cumulative actual costs is where you actually are accruing the expenditure rather than actually what you're spending, you're paying, it's what you're expending. So rather than my work being a flat line where there's no expenditure and then at the end of 5 weeks it jumps up to $10,000, it's a nice steady linear line which is going up at $2,000 a week. Now, this is a way that you can actually make sure the project is running under budget or to budget, and if that's the case, it's in surplus, and you can find out if it's going over budget or overrun or deficit, to use the accounting terms, before you at the payday at the end of the month, and you can maybe fix it. because if it's going over budget, you need to fix it right away. You need to find the money from elsewhere. You need to apply for a loan. You need to alter the project. You need to see if money can be saved in other work packages or what have you. But you can get onto the problem quicker than with cash accounting, with the cumulative budgeted cost. So this is accrual accounting. If you want more clarity on those terms, accrual accounting, cash accounting, you can look that up online. I'm not going to get into that. This is not an accounting course, but hopefully the explanation I've given you will suffice. So this is the same project again, where basically we have the equivalent project, the unlined landfill project, and we've got our budgeted cost, and you can see it's got that that long that S-shaped line, but the orange line here is not capital, it's actually actual cost. So this is actually a more useful thing for tracking expenditure, and you can see it's actually going above the budgeted cost there, or cash cost, because basically we're basically owing money to people. We might have labourers who have worked for 3 weeks. It's the third week into the month, and at the end of the month we've got to pay them for those hours of work that they've already worked. And so the actual cost line, the orange line, generally is a lot smoother, it's less jumpy, and if labour is a big portion of the budget and you're paying your labourers every month, the budgeted cost line, the blue line, will actually be jumpy. It'll sort of go up in steps at every month. So the actual cost line is a way to smooth out the data to make it more realistic. So all of this work, there's actually a job, a specialist job. Maybe you've heard this term. It's someone called a quantity surveyor. So a quantity surveyor is someone in the project management team, and his job is sort of half engineer and half accountant, if you like. And so he's basically making sure that the project is being run on budget. If you look at project management as being about cost, time, and quality constraints and finding a balance between those aspects, the quantity surveyor, he's the guy who's in charge of the cost constraint. And so it's a little bit of a funny term. Often what a lot of people think, this is one of those old memes, what people think I do. What my friends think I do, well, they have no idea, frankly. Quantity surveyor, they don't have any idea. What your family thinks you do, often they can't distinguish between you and an engineer. They don't really know what it is you're doing on the project. What the contractors think you do, well, remember the contractors, they are applying to you to be paid. When they do some work, they actually come to you and say, this is my bill, can you pay it? And if there's no money in the budget, you're in a lot of issues. And so that's very concerning. And then what do your colleagues think you do? Well, they think you're kind of boring because, quite frankly, they think you're doing all of the number crunching there. You're doing the budgets, you're doing spreadsheets. It's not the exciting work of engineering where you're doing design work and trying to work out stress and strain derivatives and that sort of thing. What the public thinks, well, they don't have any idea about surveying. They think you're carrying out a census or something. What you think you're doing, you think you're the real head guy in the project. The bosses, well, they think you're magic. They think you're Superman because you're the one who's finding the money to pay for the project. But what you're really doing is often you're you're flooded with receipts and bills to pay, and you've got to find the money to pay for it. And so I will say that when I've worked on big projects in a projectized team structure where all of us were working on one project on a dedicated worksite office, the quantity surveyor, he nearly always had the messiest desk because he had all of these bills coming through the mail every day. So this is another one. Society often thinks that you as the quantity surveyor, you're basically a land surveyor. Your mum thinks you're building great projects. The client thinks you're hoarding all this money. The tradesman thinks you don't know what you're doing. You think you're an amazing part of an amazing team delivering great projects, which you are in a way. But what you're actually doing is you do spend an awful lot of time on Excel or a similar accounting software like Mind Your Own Business or PML or Microsoft Project. And basically you're constantly doing the liquidity test to make sure that that each week you have enough money in your capital to pay your expenditure. So that's a quantity surveyor for you. If you didn't know what that term is, that's what they do. So guys, I think that's all for today. Thank you so much for listening. If you've got any questions about cost management, not just budgeting and tracking, but also tendering and estimating, please let me know. And ask questions in the Zoom tutorial, or indeed contact me by email or phone call. Thank you so much, guys. Bye. Oh gosh, one more slide. Yeah, effective project management. If you want to get this book out of the library, I believe students can go to the campus now and get out books. Pages 256 to 272. That is the supplementary reading, not homework, supplementary reading, because everything you need to know has been covered in this lecture. But if you want to read a little bit deeper, then you go to Clement's book, and it's pages 256 to 272. Thanks so much, guys. Bye.